The great hall of the alien High Council was silent, the air thick with tension. Daniel Cross, a human soldier from Earth, stood alone in the center, surrounded by tall alien figures whose glowing eyes never blinked. The walls shimmered with strange patterns that seemed alive, shifting like liquid, and the floor beneath his boots hummed softly. He had been summoned here without warning, told only that the council had an offer for him. Cool. At the far end of the hall sat the council members' 6 alien elders, their skin silver and marked with deep, glowing lines. They looked down at him from their raised seats, like judges waiting to deliver a sentence. In the center, the tallest elder counselor, Lyra, leaned forward and spoke, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Human," she said slowly. "Our world is dying." She explained that a plague had swept through their kind, taking almost all of their males. Without them, their people could not continue. The council had searched for strong, healthy males of other species who could help them survive. Daniel felt a cold shiver. He knew where this was going, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. Lyra gestured, and 2 figures stepped forward from the shadows. They were alien women sisters. She said. The first was Lyra, tall and fierce, her skin a deep shade of blue with silver patterns running down her arms, her golden eyes sharp and unyielding. The second was Serin, smaller, softer, with pale violet skin and large, luminous eyes that carried both fear and kindness. They stood close together, their hands intertwined as if they feared being separated. "Choose one," Lyra commanded. "One will join you, and together you will help repopulate our kind." The words hung in the air like a heavy stone. Daniel glanced at Lyra, stood straight, proud, her jaw tight as if daring him to choose her. Then he looked at Serin. She lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around her sister's hand. Everyone in the room expected him to pick immediately. But Daniel didn't move. His mind was racing. He saw the tension in Lyra's shoulders, the way Serin's breath shook. He realized something: the council didn't care about these 2 weren't just strangers to each other. They were family. They had survived whatever horrors this dying world had thrown at them. And now they were being told to split apart forever. He took a slow breath. The silence in the hall grew heavier, and the council began to exchange impatient glances. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I choose both." The reaction was immediate: gasps, sharp murmurs, and the rustle of alien robes as the elders sat forward. Lyra's eyes narrowed. "That is not our way," she said sharply. "Then your way is wrong," Daniel replied. "I will not tear them apart." Lyra's eyes widened for the first time, a flicker of surprise breaking through her usual guarded expression. Serin looked up at him, her lips parting slightly as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Around them, the murmurs turned into angry whispers. Words like "human arrogance" and "tradition breaker" echoed through the chamber. But Daniel stood his ground. Lyra's voice dropped into a cold, dangerous tone. "You have 3 days, human, 3 days to reconsider. If you do not," she continued, "we will take them both from you, and you will leave this world alone." The guard stepped forward, signaling the meeting was over. Daniel followed them out, his jaw clenched as they passed through the massive doorway. He glanced back. Ra was still staring at him, unreadable, while Serin clung to her sister's arm. He didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was clear: he had just made powerful enemies outside the council hall. The alien city stretched out in all directions, its towers glowing under 2 suns. But Daniel barely noticed the beauty. He could feel eyes watching him. Whispers followed him as he walked through the streets. Some aliens looked at him with curiosity, others with open hostility. He had been marked, and now his countdown to the council's deadline had begun. That night, as the twin moons rose over the alien skyline, Daniel sat alone in his quarters. He thought about Lyra's sharp, fearless gaze and Serin's quiet, fragile strength. He didn't know why, but deep inside, he felt a responsibility for them both. Not just because of the Council's offer, but because they had no one else willing to fight for them. And he had just promised without even saying the words that he would. The morning after the council meeting, the alien city felt different. It wasn't just the strange hum of the floating streets or the glowing clouds drifting above, was the way everyone looked at Daniel now. Their eyes followed him, cold and suspicious, whispers curling like smoke in the air. He could almost hear the words without understanding their language: outsider, troublemaker, disrespectful, inside the High Council chamber. The elders were already speaking about him. Lyra sat at the head of the table, her long fingers tapping against the polished black stone. "He defies our ways," one elder hissed, his voice sharp like glass. "Humans have no right to question our traditions." Another added, her silver eyes glowing with irritation. Lyra raised her hand, silencing them. "He will change his mind," she said with icy confidence, "and if he does not, we will make him." The other elders nodded slowly, but there was unease in their faces. Humans were unpredictable, and this one had already proven he would not bow easily. Meanwhile, Daniel was not allowed to leave the palace grounds without escort. 2 guards with tall, spear-like weapons followed him everywhere. He ignored them and walked through the crystal gardens, where the air smelled faintly of burning metal. That was where he saw Lyra and Serin again, sitting by a small pool that shimmered with green light. Lyra looked up first, her golden eyes sharp. "You are either very brave or very stupid, human," she said flatly. Daniel smirked slightly. "Maybe both." Serin glanced at him nervously, her voice soft. "You should not have said that to the council. They will be angry. They already are," Daniel replied. "But I meant it. No one's separating you two while I'm here." Lyra studied him for a long moment, as if trying to see if he was lying, when she finally looked away. Daniel noticed her hand still holding Serin's tightly. It wasn't just protection, it was survival. Whatever they had been through, it had forged a bond stronger than fear. That night, the council made their first move. A messenger arrived at Daniel's quarters, bringing a silver tray with alien food that glowed faintly. The messenger's expression was too calm, his movements too precise. Daniel didn't touch the food, and later, when he fed it to a stray alien creature outside, it collapsed instantly. He didn't need further proofs. Someone had just tried to poison him. The next day, Lyra summoned him again. She sat in the chamber alone this time, her eyes fixed on him as he entered. "You have 2 days left," she said, without greeting. "If you choose one, we will honor our promise. Choose both, and you will lose everything." Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "Then I will lose everything." Her expression tightened, the faintest crack in her calm mask. "You think you are protecting them," she said slowly, "but you are only making things worse for them." Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Worse would be letting you tear them apart." That answer earned him more than just her anger, earned her respect. Though she would never admit it, she dismissed him without another word, but her eyes followed him until he left the room. Daniel knew she was planning something, and whatever it was, it would come soon. That evening, Lyra came to his quarters unexpectedly. She closed the door behind her and stood with her arms crossed. "Serin had a nightmare," she said, her tone sharp but her eyes softer than before. "She thinks they will take us tonight." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then picked up his pack and checked his sidearm. "Then we make sure they don't," he said. Lyra didn't smile, but something in her posture shifted like a warrior who had finally found an ally. She stayed while Serin joined them, her eyes wide with fear. Daniel lit a small lantern, the warm glow casting shadows on the walls. He kept watch all night, listening to every sound outside, every creak of the floor, every whisper of movement in the halls. And somewhere deep in the city, the council's plan was already in motion. They would test him before the final day. They would push him until he broke. But Daniel Cross had no intention of breaking, not for them. And not while the two sisters still had no one else to stand for them. The next morning, the alien city was covered in a soft mist. The glowing towers looked like ghostly shapes in the fog. And the streets were strangely quiet. Daniel walked through the palace courtyard with Lyra and Serin at his side, 2 guards. Trailing them silently, it felt too calm, like the city was holding its breath. Waiting for something to happen, they reached the library gardens. A place filled with crystal trees and floating lights. Serin's eyes wandered curiously over the glowing flowers. Her soft fingers brushing the petals. Lyra stayed close to Daniel, scanning every shadow as if expecting trouble at any moment. Her soldier's instincts never seemed to rest. Daniel tried to start a conversation. "You two have lived here all your lives." Serin nodded quietly. "Not here." "Not in the palace," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Lyra's golden eyes hardened. "We lived in the outer settlements until the war." Daniel could tell she didn't like talking about it, but he didn't push. Still, the sisters began to share pieces of their story. The war had destroyed their home. Their parents had been taken, and the sisters had been captured by raiders. They had spent years surviving in camps where food was traded for obedience. Lyra had fought too. Protect Serin, taking beatings meant for her younger sister. Daniel listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every detail. The sisters had been freed only when the plague hit the planet. With so few males left, the council had rounded up women of good lineage for the repopulation program. That was how they ended up here on display for selection. Daniel hated the thought of them being treated like prizes. While they talked, Daniel noticed something strange. A tall alien figure stood at the far end of the garden, half hidden behind a crystal pillar. The moment Daniel looked directly at him, the figure turned and disappeared into the mist. Lyra noticed too, her hand tightening around the small blade she always carried. Back in his quarters, Daniel started making notes, routes in and out of the palace. Guard rotations, places to hide. He didn't know when the council would make their move, but he wanted to be ready. Lyra watched him from the corner. Her arms crossed. "You're planning something," she said. "I'm planning to keep you." "To save," he replied without looking up. Serin sat beside him, her voice gentle. "You don't have to do this. We've always managed to survive." Daniel looked at her seriously. "Surviving isn't the same as living." She didn't answer, but her eyes softened that night. Daniel asked the sisters to stay in his quarters rather than their own. He didn't trust the guards, and he didn't trust the council's patience. Lyra agreed immediately, while Serin hesitated but finally nodded. They set up a small sleeping area in the corner. The faint hum of the palace walls surrounding them. Like a heartbeat, hours later, Daniel was awake, sitting in the dark. He heard faint footsteps outside the door to light to be the guards. Too careful to be casual, he reached for his sidearm, signaling Lyra with a hand gesture. She was already awake. Her blade ready, the footsteps paused, then retreated. Whoever it was, they knew he was listening. By morning, the tension was sharper. The sisters stuck close to Daniel, and the guards seemed more watchful than before. When they walked through the market square inside the palace, Daniel caught sight of the same tall alien from the garden. This time, the stranger didn't hide. He simply stared at Daniel with cold, calculating eyes before melting into the crowd. Lyra leaned toward Daniel, her voice low. "That one works for the council." Daniel didn't doubt it. The council wasn't just waiting for his decision. They were already moving pieces into place. Every step he took, every word he said, was being watched. That evening, Serin whispered something that made Daniel's blood run cold. "When we were in the camps," she said, "there were always people watching. And when they watched too closely, it meant someone was about to disappear." Lyra's jaw tightened. "They're not taking us, human," she said, her tone almost like a vow. Daniel nodded slowly, his hand resting near his weapon. "They'll have to go through me first," he said. But deep down, he knew the Council would try exactly that soon. Asterix night fell over the alien city like a heavy curtain. The twin moons rose above the glowing towers, casting silver light across the palace walls inside Daniel's quarters. The air was quiet, but tense. Lyra sat near the door, sharpening her blade, her golden eyes glinting in the lamplight. Serin was curled up on a blanket, pretending to read a data tablet but glancing at the door every few seconds. Daniel had been pacing for an hour, checking and rechecking his weapon. Something in his gut told him tonight would not be like the others. He had spent enough time in battle to know when danger was coming, and tonight, danger felt close enough to touch. The sound came just past midnight, a faint scrape of metal against the outer wall. Lyra's head snapped up instantly, her hand tightening on the blade. Daniel motioned for silence. They all listened. The scrape came again, followed by a soft thud. Someone was climbing. Without a word, Daniel moved to the wall panel and killed the lights. The room sank into darkness, leaving only the pale glow of the moons through the window. Serin's breathing quickened, but she stayed quiet, pressing herself into the shadows. Lyra slid toward the window, her movements silent and practiced. A faint shadow passed across the glass. Daniel stepped closer, his sidearm raised. The glass shattered inward with a violent crash. Shards sprang across the floor. Two masked aliens leaped inside, their movements fast and precise. One went straight for Serin, the other for Lyra. Lyra moved like lightning, slashing upward with her blade. The attacker jerked back, narrowly avoiding the strike. Daniel fired a shot, the sound sharp in the small room. The bullet hit the first intruder in the shoulder, spinning him sideways, but the second was already grabbing Serin. Her cry cut through the chaos. Daniel lunged, tackling the masked alien and slamming him against the wall. The intruder dropped Serin, but struck Daniel hard in the ribs. Pain shot through him, but he didn't let go. Lyra kicked her attacker's legs out from under him, driving her blade into the floor beside his head as a warning. "Get out, or I make it worse," she snarled. The first intruder staggered toward the window, clutching his injured shoulder. The second tried to follow, but Daniel grabbed the back of his armor and yanked him down. They struggled, fists and elbows striking in the dim light. Finally, Daniel shoved him out the window, the alien landing hard on the balcony below before vanishing into the shadows. Silence fell again. The only sounds were Serin's trembling breaths and the faint hum of the city outside. Daniel moved quickly, closing the broken window with a makeshift seal. Lyra stood watch, her chest rising and falling with adrenaline. Serin clung to her sister's arm, her eyes wide with shock. "They were after you." "Ah," Daniel said, his voice low. Lyra nodded grimly. "They'll try again." Daniel already knew who had sent them. The Council wanted to scare him into changing his choice. But this was more than a warning. This was a message. "We can reach you any time." He checked the hallway outside, finding no guards. That was strange. 2 guards had been stationed outside every night before. Tonight, there was no one that told him everything he needed to know the Council had allowed this attack to happen. Back inside, Lyra was cleaning the blade, her hands steady despite the fight. Serin sat beside Daniel, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here." Daniel nodded. "We won't." If the Council thought intimidation would make him give up, they didn't know him at all. They spent the rest of the night awake, weapons ready. Daniel kept glancing toward the door, expecting it to burst open again, but the attackers didn't return when dawn came. The first light revealed the damage, the broken glass, the blood on the floor, the marks from the struggle. As the sun rose over the alien city, Daniel made A decision they would leave the palace before nightfall. It didn't matter if the council called it defiance from now on. He wasn't waiting for their next move, he was making his own. The palace gates loomed tall under the morning sun. Their surface shimmered like liquid metal, guarded by soldiers in silver armor. Daniel stood in the shadows of the courtyard, watching the guards' movements, memorizing the moments when they squashed away the moments when they looked away. Beside him, Lyra adjusted the strap of a small pack filled with stolen supplies. Serin clutched a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes darting nervously to every corner. They had no permission to leave if the council caught them. There would be no second chance, but staying in the palace meant waiting for the next attack hand. Daniel wasn't willing to gamble with their lives. They moved when the market bells rang, the sound echoing through the city. Crowds flooded the streets, and Daniel used them as cover. The sisters walked close to him. Blending into the flow of alien citizens, Lyra kept her head high, scanning the rooftops for watchers. Serin stayed quiet, her hand holding on to Daniel's sleeve. The city gave way to the outer walls, where tall gates opened to the wild lands. Beyond, 2 guards stood there, checking every traveler who passed. Daniel handed over forged travel documents he had stolen from the palace archives. The guard scanned them, frowning for a moment. Lyra's grip on her pack tightened, but the guard waved them through, stepping aside without a word. Beyond the gates, the air changed. The sharp metallic scent of the city faded, replaced by the earthy smell of alien forests. Trees with glowing blue leaves stretched high into the mist, their roots twisting like frozen snakes. Strange calls echoed in the distance, animal voices unlike anything Daniel had heard before. They walked for hours, the ground soft under their boots. Lyra moved like she knew the land, pointing out plants they could eat and streams they could drink from. Serin followed close, her eyes wide at the beauty of the glowing flowers that lit the forest paths. For a moment, Daniel almost felt they might make it out without trouble. But trouble came before nightfall. While they crossed a narrow bridge of stone over a dark river, Lyra froze mid-step. She raised her hand in warning. Daniel listened there. Faint but clear came the sound of footsteps behind them, not the careless steps of travelers, but the steady rhythm of trained hunters. "They've sent pursuers," Lyra said under her breath. Daniel didn't look back. "How far until we reach the valley?" 2 days, he replied. "If we move fast, that wasn't good enough." They quickened their pace, weaving through the forest paths. The light faded fast as the twin moons began to rise, casting pale beams through the leaves. Serin's breathing grew heavier, but she didn't complain. Daniel kept checking their back trail, spotting flickers of movement in the shadows. 3, maybe 4 figures following. By night, they reached a small clearing with a waterfall spilling into a glowing pool. It was beautiful, but Daniel knew beauty didn't mean safety. They took a short rest, filling their flasks from the water while Lyra stood guard. Serin sat beside Daniel, whispering, "Do you think they'll catch us?" Daniel shook his head. "Not if I can help it." They moved on, choosing a narrow path between 2 cliffs. It was risky. The walls on either side could be used to trap them, but it was also faster. The air grew colder here, mist curling around their legs. Somewhere above, a bird-like creature gave a long, haunting cry. Then Daniel heard something worse, the faint metallic click of a weapon being cocked down. He shouted, pulling Serin to the ground as a plasma bolt burned past them. Lyra spun and threw her blade, the weapon striking sparks against a rock where one of the pursuers had been hiding. Figures emerged from the shadows, masked and armed. The same type who had attacked them in the palace, only now they were on open ground. Daniel fired back, forcing the pursuers to take cover. "Run!" He shouted to the sisters, covering them as they sprinted down the path. They didn't stop until the cliffs opened into another stretch of forest. By the time they slowed, the sounds of pursuit had faded. but Daniel knew it was only temporary. They found shelter under the roots of a massive tree. The hollow space dry and hidden from view. Lyra took the first watch, her eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Serin curled up beside Daniel, her voice soft. "You could have left us, but you didn't." Daniel looked at her, his voice steady. "I told you why I'm not letting you go." Above them, in the dark canopy, unseen eyes were still watching. The Council's hunters weren't done, and the path ahead was only going to get more dangerous by the second night in the forest. Daniel knew they couldn't keep running forever. The sisters were tired, Serin's steps were slower, and even Lyra, strong as she was, had stopped to catch her breath more than once. They needed to cross into the hidden valley beyond the cliffs before the hunters caught up. There was only one way, a narrow trail that ended at a roaring waterfall. With a single bridge of stone leading across, the sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached. Mist clung to their faces, cold and damp. The moonlight painted the scene in silver, the waterfall crashing down into an endless pool below. The bridge was slick and narrow, with no railing, only a sheer drop on both sides. Daniel stopped just short of it. "We cross now," he said, "and we don't stop." But before they could take a step, Lyra froze, her head turning sharply toward the trees. Daniel heard it too, the soft crunch of boots on wet leaves. Shadows moved between the glowing trees, and then the hunters stepped into view. There were 5 this time, masked and armored, weapons ready. The leader's voice was cold. "Step aside, human. You don't belong to this world." Daniel raised his sidearm, his stance unshaken. "Neither do they, at least not the world you want for them." Lyra moved to stand beside him, spear in hand. Serin, though trembling, reached into her pack and pulled out a small bow. The 3 of them formed a line in front of the bridge. The leader gave a signal, and the hunters moved forward. The first plasma shot lit up the mist, sizzling past Daniel's head. He returned fire, the sound of his gun sharp over the waterfall's roar. Lyra lunged forward, striking with the spear, and forcing one attacker back. Serin's arrow flew, hitting another in the leg and making him stumble. The battle became chaos. The slick rocks made footing dangerous, each step a risk of falling into the water below. One hunter swung a blade at Daniel. He caught the arm, twisted, and shoved him into the stone wall. Lyra was a whirlwind, blocking one strike and countering with another, her golden eyes blazing. Serin stayed behind them, aiming carefully and firing whenever she saw an opening. Then Daniel heard the sound he dreaded, a low hum, followed by a sharp burst. A plasma bolt hit him in the side. The heat seared through his armor, knocking him to one knee. Pain ripped through him, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself up. Lyra caught him by the arm, shoving him back just in time to block another strike. The hunters pressed forward, trying to push them off the bridge. Daniel planted his boots and fired again, forcing 2 of them to dive for cover. One hunter charged at Serin, but she ducked low, rolling to the side and loosing an arrow into his shoulder. Lyra's spear caught another in the chest, sending him tumbling back into the mist. Finally, the leader stepped forward, weapon raised. Daniel met him head-on, blocking the first strike and slamming his shoulder into him. The impact sent them both stumbling dangerously close to the edge. The leader tried to shove Daniel over, but Daniel twisted at the last second, using the man's own momentum to send him plunging into the water below. The remaining hunters hesitated. Lyra took a step forward, her spear pointed directly at them. "Go," she growled, "or you join him." The hunters backed away, disappearing into the mist without another word. The sound of the waterfall filled the silence. Daniel leaned against the stone, his breathing heavy, his side burning with pain. Lyra and Serin moved quickly to help him across the bridge. Every step was slow, but they didn't stop until they reached the other side. They collapsed on the grassy bank, the mist still curling around them. Lyra looked at Daniel, her voice softer than usual. "You should have let me handle them." Daniel shook his head. "Not how I work." Serin knelt beside him, checking the wound with trembling hands. "You're hurt." Daniel managed a faint smile. "We're all still here. That's what matters." Above them, the roar of the waterfall drowned out the distant sounds of the hunters retreating. They had won this fight, but Daniel knew the council wouldn't stop until they either gave up or disappeared for good. The path beyond the waterfall was narrow and steep. Mist clung to their clothes as they climbed, Daniel leaning heavily on Lyra's shoulder while Serin carried his pack. Every step was slow. But the air felt different, here cleaner, warmer. And untouched by the reach of the council, Lyra glanced back every few minutes, her eyes scanning the cliffs for signs of pursuit, but no shadows followed and no voices echoed behind them by midday. They reached the top of the trail. The land opened into a wide valley surrounded by towering stone walls. A crystal-clear lake lay in the center, fed by smaller waterfalls that trickled down the cliffs. The grass here was soft and green, dotted with wildflowers that shimmered in the sunlight. Strange, gentle creatures grazed nearby, their fur glowing faintly under the twin suns. Serin gasped at the sight, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Daniel smiled faintly, despite the pain in his side, and safe. Lyra nodded, though she kept her expression guarded. Safe for now. They made camp by the lake. Daniel lowered himself onto a blanket while Lyra and Serin worked together to set up shelter. Lyra built a small fire using dried reeds, her movements quick and practiced. Serin gathered fruit from the trees and brought water from the lake. For the first time in days, there was no rush, no fear of someone bursting out of the shadows when night fell. The valley glowed softly under the twin moons. The fire crackled, casting warm light on their faces. Daniel sat leaning against a rock, his wound cleaned and wrapped. Lyra sat beside him, sharpening her spear out of habit. Serin sat close on his other side, her hands cupped around a mug of warm herbal drink. For a long time, none of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy like. In the palace it was peaceful. Finally, Serin broke it with a quiet voice. "Why did you choose both of us?" Daniel looked at her, then at Lyra. "Because you're sisters," he said simply. "And no one has the right to tear you apart." Serin's eyes softened, and Lyra's gaze dropped to the ground. She didn't thank him out loud, but the slight nod she gave was enough in her own way. She understood that Daniel had risked everything for them. The days turned into weeks. They built a small home using stones from the cliffs and wood from the forest. It was simple but sturdy, with a roof of woven reeds and a fire pit in the center. Lyra hunted in the forest, bringing back fresh meat. Serin tended a small garden near the lake, planting seeds she found in the valley. Daniel worked alongside them when his strength returned, repairing the shelter and setting traps for protection. Life was still not easy. They had to be careful, avoiding hunters who might venture too close to the valley. But there was laughter now, and the sound of voices sharing stories around the fire. Daniel began to see smiles on Serin's face more often, and even Lyra allowed herself moments of quiet contentment. One evening, as the sun set behind the cliffs, painting the sky in gold and violet, Lyra stood beside Daniel. "You could leave now that you've brought us here," she said, her tone almost like a challenge. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not leaving." Serin came to stand on his other side, her voice soft. "Then this is home." The three of them stood together, watching the last light fade. Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years, not just relief, but belonging. He hadn't only chosen both sisters that day in the council hall, he had chosen a family worth fighting for, worth protecting, no matter how far the council's reach extended. In the distance, the waterfall roared, its sound steady and eternal, and in the quiet safety of the hidden valley. The human and the two alien sisters began the first chapter of their new life together.